one relationship that was frowned upon. Everybody was supposed to share everybody, which to me seems to be in line with this concept of the ego death. I think that this is, I think this has a lot to do with this movement of scientism to give up the self, which you've been saying, to give up the person and give yourself to something greater. Because like ego, most people aren't aware that ego actually means I am. And this concept of ego death seems to be this new age concept seems to be in line with the plan to just give everybody to give up themselves to the state.
Yes, and here in many senses, if we look at the Enlightenment, for example, the Enlightenment has been engaged, since the Enlightenment, they've engaged in a process of taking spiritual concepts and putting them into a scientific thing. So the concept of the Enlightenment itself is a spiritual concept. Illuminati is a spiritual concept. They do it all the time. They appropriate spiritual terms and repackage it. Now, for me, in the mystical journey, it's very, very clear that the first phase in all the traditions in looking at a perennial philosophy is that you have to engage in some transcendence of an internal construct which is limiting. So if you begin to become attached to an idea of yourself which is embedded in the material world too much internally, then you find it difficult to have that identification with higher consciousness. So if you operate under the illusion that you are atomized, that you are independent of the rest of the world, that you are separate, that you are totally sovereign, well, that's a problem. So the ego death, or perhaps, I think that's really where the domain of transcendence is, when in many senses, the first and major transcendence is to become aware that, not that you don't exist as a person, but that your consciousness is part of the divine consciousness and is a reflection. So as, if you like, it's a pool which has water, but there is a great ocean. It's made of the same substance, it's in a different form, but it's still, or holographically for some people, it's the same stuff. So the concept that you're referring to in the ego death is more a reference to a stage in the mystical journey, but it doesn't depersonalize or dehumanize the person. And some people, in the context of referring to idealism and in the philosophical school, say, oh well, we should forget who we are, that forget that you have a name, forget that. Now that's a mistake in my view. That's a mistake to take that too far, because that's not what the implication of, because the reaction of a lot of the critics of technology like Ellul and Charbonneau, who came from Calvinist or Catholic and Marxist background as well, when they were advocating personalism, they emphasized the idea of incarnation, to accept the idea of incarnation, that we're here in the flesh now. And you see this in other trends in personalism. Martin Luther King said that he did a talk about accepting yourself, or how the individual man or woman could live in this very complex world now. And he emphasized the need to accept yourself, who you are, how you look, what your appearance, whatever. It's a very strong idea in personalism, that you have to become comfortable with yourself. And then we can add in the other ones that came, the idea of self-actualization, which is related again to another personalist stream, to Goldstein, and a lot of thinkers that came from Germany, some of them came to the United States. So now, when we put it in a technological context, the idea is totally different. The idea is, we are going to take your personality, we are going to take your personhood, we are going to take your selfhood, we are going to take what is your dignity, we're going to disregard it, we're going to wipe the blackboard clean, we're going to say no personhood, no selfhood. You're not an agent. And in the theory of Donald Hoffman, for example, about conscious agents, so that if you look at that, he said I couldn't make out where I stood on him until I read the book, and there was one sentence in the book where he said that consciousness is fundamental, but human consciousness is neither fundamental nor distinctive. Now, that's the key distinction. So what that scheme is in conscious agents is to say that if something can compute and do things and act in some way intelligently, we can ascribe consciousness to it in a kind of mathematical way. But humans thereafter are only one of these conscious agents. So robots can be conscious agents, but they will be more valuable because they'll be more conscious presumably, if they can compute. So that's totally different from the spiritual tradition, which says, and it's very, very clear, and I believe it to be true, that each of us has within them consciousness, which is the greatest force in the universe. Now, if people realize that, and that's in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, that idea of looking and beginning to understand yourself as that, it's a very deep, simple, real proposition. You begin to understand that you are this consciousness. And then out of that, you realize that you have the potential. And out of that, you have the creativity. And your job then is to actualize that, as Maslow talked about in his hierarchy of needs, when he noticed that people that had mystical experiences were usually the most accomplished. They had moved beyond other needs. They were able to satisfy them and go to self-actualization. And again, that self-actualization idea goes back to a personalist, a person who advocated that idea of focusing on the human person. So I agree with you. They're two different things. So you have to be careful not to give away your personhood, not to allow yourself to be reduced to a number. This is happening all the time, all the commercial systems. I noticed that a few years ago when they started this self-service, that you go into a shop one day and they're saying, hello, how are you? Next day, they're herding you like cattle to work for them and not paying you. I found it very offensive. I mean, because I do find it, because it's a technique which reduces you. And even Yuval Noah Harari wrote an essay in 2018 in The Atlantic where he said that we were increasingly going to be treated like domestic cattle. And this is nearly 100 years later, well, 90 years later, saying what Bernal said was going to happen about the human zoo. So we have to be very, very careful. My argument in all this, if you want to interpret transhumanism, you have to look back and see where it was 100 years ago, where it came from. And these techniques will reduce us to domestic animals at best before we're disappeared, because we're seen to be difficult for the planet. And associated, to finish off on this point, sorry, associated with that is an idea of misanthropy, a hatred of humans, which is very, very deep. And it seems to go sometimes with people who love machines. And maybe it's because machines are easier to deal with. They're easier to control. It satisfies a control mechanism. They're not going to disappoint you in the same way that a human might do. They're not as messy. So there is something in the mindset which is creating a world in its own image, which is again part of the godlike thing.
Right. And it seems that, as you were